The Socialist Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, a rather undiplomatic diplomat, had this to say at the UN yesterday.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
In response, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, said this.
But the UN is failing. The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism.
The UN Secretary-General comments about the genocidal act of terrorism on the 7th of October seem to justify it in some way. And whilst his response is somewhat cryptic, others have been even more explicit about this. Take, for example, Latifa Abu-Shakara, the woman ITV News interviewed regarding Islamophobia, who told the channel, "It makes me feel as a Muslim woman in this country that no matter how hard I work, no matter how good I can be, it will never be enough because apparently Muslims and Palestinians are inherently terrorists." It later emerged she is actually a reporter for the Iranian state-funded press TV broadcaster, as exposed by GB News' very own Charlie Peters, and she actually had this to say about the recent attacks on Israel.
Nothing will ever be able to take back this moment of triumph, this moment of resistance, this moment of surprise, this moment of humiliation on behalf of the Zionist entity.
How could she say this moment of triumph, this moment of resistance? What an appalling thing to say, and no wonder ITV subsequently apologised. And we saw this happen in New York yesterday at a pro-Palestinian rally.
Resistance is justified! Resistance is justified! When people are occupied! When people are occupied! Resistance is justified! Resistance is justified! When people are occupied! When people are occupied!
Resistance is justified if people are occupied. What awful nonsense is this? That acts of evil, beheading babies, is not justified by anything. And the fact that the Gaza hadn't been occupied in nearly 20 years didn't seem to bother these protesters. Now, bubbling under the surface of this movement is something sinister. While they talk of supporting innocent Palestinians, all too often they appear to go further to justify murdering 1,400 innocent people as a legitimate act of resistance. And it's this that has got the Secretary-General of the United Nations into trouble, because he has got his fingers too close to this really appalling view of the world, this idea that seems to think that what Hamas has done is something to be accepted or even celebrated, rather than to be unequivocally condemned or is even in any way justified, because to endorse or make excuses for Hamas is not only glorification of terrorism, it's also desperately unfair on the decent Palestinians living in Palestine who do not support Hamas, but who get portrayed as being represented by Hamas by the type of people who buy into the Secretary-General's phraseology. And if Hamas were truly to represent Palestinians, then there's no hope for peace in this conflict. So for the UN Secretary-General, who was, of course, a former leader of the Socialist International, Antonio Guterres, to echo this sort of rhetoric is worse than improper. And it's worse than showing the impotence of the United Nations. It is a real failure of leadership. He's meant to be a diplomat. He's not meant to be somebody who's making the problem worse. No wonder the Israelis have called for him to go. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts via mailmog@gbnews.com.